Hey guys, I'm excited today. I have Josh Patterson on. Um, I became friends with him a while back on Facebook. He was a mutual friend of my friend Bryce, who's been on the podcast before. And I found out that Josh has his own podcast called Rethinking Faith. It's really great. I've listened to a lot of episodes, and lately he's just been putting out banger after banger episodes. So I thought I'd humble him and have him on so that we could have a worse episode. So you come back down to earth a little bit.
Right on.
Yeah. So you want to give us a little intro to yourself and a little bit of your background?
Yeah, sure. Well, first off, thanks for having me. I'm excited to hang out. But yeah, my name is Josh Patterson. Like you said, I host the Rethinking Faith podcast, which where I'm actually about to celebrate the 5th birthday of, which is crazy.
Wow. Congrats.
Coming up in October, it would be 5 years. But yeah, I'm a former pastor. I served in vocational ministry for about 6 years. And then I, for a series of complicated reasons, ended up leaving vocational ministry and became a brewer. Not coffee, but beer. So I was making beer for a while. And recently, for another, series of complicated reasons, I've actually re-entered the church world to an extent, not as a pastor, but as a simple and hopefully humble administrator. So now I'm hanging out in a tiny little Episcopal church as their parish admin, and that's been a lot of fun so far. So, yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. And Josh is really into process theology, and I've heard him talk about it, and it really intrigued me. And so I thought I'd have him on to talk about kind of a broad overview of what that is and any questions I can ask. So tell me first, is open and relational theology, is that the same thing, or is that different, or is that related? How does that work in?
Yeah, sure. So probably how the best way to put it would be all process thinkers are open and relational, but not all open relational thinkers are process thinkers.
Got it.
So, yeah. Open and relational is just kind of like a nice umbrella that includes process thinking. But if you're an open and relational thinker, it doesn't necessitate you being a process thinker.
Okay.
There are a lot of very popular open and relational thinkers that are not process people, like John Sanders, for example. Very famous in the open and relational world, not a process guy.
Okay. So where does process theology come from as far as the history in Christian theology?
Yeah, sure. So it started with a guy named Alfred North Whitehead, who was a kind of famous mathematician and also a philosopher.
Wow.
And he kind of developed process philosophy. He didn't call it that. He kind of referred to it more so as like a theology of organism. Excuse me. And then it was kind of taken and appropriated later into the realms of theology by people like Charles Hartshorne, who was one of Whitehead's students. And then more recently, people like David Ray Griffin or John Cobb, Catherine Keller, Marjorie Suhaki. These have been some of the kind of Christian thinkers who have taken process thought and kind of brought it into the Christian world. Try to say okay, what if we take this philosophical system and have it play with our theology? What kind of fun things might happen?
Interesting. Wow. I had no idea it was originally a philosophy thing and not necessarily brought up from the Christian tradition.
Yep. Yeah, it came. So Whitehead himself actually, when he sought out doing his kind of big, metaphysical philosophy thing that he was trying to do, he actually kind of got rid of the idea of God. And then he actually came back to a belief in God because of his philosophical kind of musings, and his system, so to speak, doesn't work without the divine. And so, Whitehead, and then ultimately Whitehead did adopt Christian thinking, but that wasn't really his goal. He didn't set out to do that. He set out to kind of give this overarching philosophical metaphysical system,
right?
And then it plays nicely with Christianity.
Okay, interesting. and I've heard of James Cobb. I don't know about those other names. And so the Christians that have adopted that, how do I ask? Were they already a part of a tradition and that kind of melded in with their tradition, or is that its own thing, its own tradition, I guess?
Yeah, so it seems like whenever I look at some of like the leading thinkers within the field who have adopted process thinking, there seems to be a lot of Methodist,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe that's because there's a school called Claremont, which is like a seminary, and they have a lot of process thinkers there that kind of developed in that school, doing theology and such. So I don't know if there's like one tradition necessarily that all of these thinkers kind of came from. But I think they maybe had some similar, perhaps questions they were asking, or maybe, things that would keep them up at night or something like that, that kind of, brought them into the world of process thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it sounds like it's very unique, not being a philosophical thing and then being adopted and then not necessarily being its own tradition and its own churches. So that's very interesting. Is there any other theology that's like that in Christianity, or is this kind of is it unique thing?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure actually. Process definitely is unique. In that there's a lot of people who process thinking kind of makes them a little bit uncomfortable because of some of the things that it challenges or asks questions about.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't know if there's, I'm sure there's different, like philosophical traditions within Christianity that are, different, because everybody is bringing philosophy to their theology. Like philosophy and theology are kind of difficult to separate.
Yeah.
And we all have these kind of like, metaphysical traditions that our theology has grown out of. For example, like the tradition I grew up in, which is like a more evangelical tradition, a lot of the theology is based off of ancient Greek metaphysics and philosophy. And that's not bad. That's just naming what it is, So, that's not necessarily an answer to your question, but just to point out, like, there are different philosophical streams within the Christian tradition, and I just happen to find process to be my favorite one.
Right, and that's helpful. And anybody can go listen to your latest episode where you talk about Neoplatonism and process theology, the similarities and differences, and that was really fascinating and complex, but it was good. So I appreciate that. So you want to get into what is process theology?
Yeah, sure. So I was trying to think like the best way to do this, because it's unfortunately one of the things that sucks about process thinking is that it's like a really complex system, and like Whitehead was literally like making up words for things. And so then you have to like it becomes difficult. So anyway, there's these three kind of like points isn't quite the right word. I guess points, convictions, whatever you want to say, that I'm borrowing from Phil Clayton and Andrew Schwartz. They're also both process thinkers. And they kind of give these three that I thought were really nice because they're not overcomplicated and they kind of capture the heart in a very generic way. So I can maybe read all three of them, and then, we can maybe talk about each one. I don't know.
Yeah, for sure.
How you'd want to do it. But so the first one is this: no one can cross the same river twice. Being is becoming. So that's the process bit of it. I'll say it one more time. Nobody can cross the same river twice. Being is becoming. So that's the process. The next one has to do with the relational aspect, because we like to say process relational philosophy or theology. And that relational aspect is this: no person is an island. All things are interconnected. Which is a fun one. I like that one. And then finally, the third one has to do with the inherent value in and through all things. And so one way to say that is that we seek to see heaven in a wildflower. All living things have value. And so those three things are very broad and generic, and they don't kind of get down into like the nitty gritty like weeds. But I think they're a nice way to frame what process thinking is, or at least some convictions that kind of lead the framework, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, I love those. Those are great. I think of the first one, no one can cross the same river twice, being is becoming. I think of spiral dynamics and how it's a evolutionary process of growth, and we might come around to the same issues or same kind of things, but it's in the spiral, but it's always different every time. And identity isn't you're always changing, and so identity isn't a static thing that you're stuck with this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really big part of process thinking, is that so it doesn't see things as static. So it's not, this is some big like philosophical jargon, but it's the ontology, the like how things work of process thinking is not substance based, which is like very typical of a lot of Western thinking, but it's rather event based. And so everything is literally a process. So you and I are not static beings, but rather we are a process. We're a society of organisms, something like that. And so when we say no one can cross the same river twice, you could maybe even argue that no one can cross this, when I am outside the river and then I go to step into the river, I'm not the same person I was before I stepped in. So really, you can't even cross the same river once.
Because it's not the same, because we're different, and the river is probably different as well. And I mean, I think that's more honest, even scientifically, because just like you think about cells and they're constantly dying and new cells. And so really it is true. Even our essence, our physical being is a process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And then if you think of a river, right, it's flowing, it's constantly moving. And so that's kind of the process bit, but where that becomes not just, an idea about you and I or about rivers, process theology then takes that and applies it to God and says, so too, God is also in process. Which is where we can start to get in trouble. Yes.
Yeah.
Some people might not like that too much. Because that, that's where it starts to break down some of, what's called classical theism. And specifically kind of the idea of like immutability, that God does not change.
Right.
Which the way a process person might talk about that would say that they would just want to nuance that. So they would say the essence of who God is does not change, but God's experience changes moment to moment. If that makes sense. So we're never going to have like one day God is love, and then the next day we wake up and God is angry and sadistic or something like that. So the again, another like really nerdy way of saying it is God has an essence, experience binate. God's essence stays the same, experience changes.
Yeah. I think that goes with number 2. Just that all things are interconnected. So God is interconnected, and also number 3. When I hear number 3, we see heaven in a wildflower. All things have value. It's like God is. Would you say that process is very synonymous with panentheism?
Yes. I'm sure they're out there, but most that there might be process thinkers who do not embrace panentheism, but it seems kind of part and parcel with how it works, with how process is. So very much so.
And so in panentheism, if God is in all things, things are changing, and so God is experiencing the universe through the universe, through everyone, and seeing from their eyes. And so everyone's experience, or like a tree's experience, whatever, is adding to God's who he is and his experience, but it doesn't change his essence.
Exactly. Yep, exactly. And so what might also make it a little bit more clear for people is earlier you asked about open and relational versus process. So in open and relational, the open bit is making a claim about how time works. Because an open theist would say the future does not yet exist. And so like, therefore it can't be known or something like that. So within process thought, it's the same. The future doesn't exist yet. And so God in each moment fully brings the experience of all creation or all the universe, all that is, into the divine self, and then basically evaluates it and then gives possibilities to all living things in each moment. So God is constantly inheriting what happens in each moment of becoming, evaluating it, and then offering divine possibilities. So God is learning and growing and going with the world, or with creation, with the universe, with you and I. And so it's constantly learning and gaining and growing.
Yeah, that's interesting. It kind of makes sense to me in the phrase of like God makes good out of all things. And so it's like we have our free will, but in each choice, God is like, I'm going to try to make the best possibility out of whatever you choose. And so constantly evaluating and giving the best choices, but you know, we could choose another, but then he's like, let me reevaluate. Let me give you the best choice after this.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, that's it. So it's like, it's cool in that because, you know, the idea that, I'm so bad at quoting scripture, but the idea that like God's grace are like renewed every morning or something like that, right? Well, in this framework, it's not just only that grace is new every morning, but in each moment of becoming. Because even when we do really stupid things, God still takes that moment, evaluates it, and then still puts in front of us possibilities that are good and beautiful and true, you know, and towards love and these kind of things. Yeah, which in my opinion makes God like way bigger than I ever thought. Because God's not only doing that for me and for you in each moment, but for everything that is, all of creation. So that's kind of a pretty big God, if you ask me.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I mean, I've gone into the woo-woo. I've talked about a little bit on this podcast, and how New Age people think about it is God created the universe to experience everything. And so it's like they kind of have that idea too. He's learning through experience, through our experience as well. And that's a part of creation and the reason for creation.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of the, it's funny because I came to a lot of my process stuff actually because of my interaction with like the mystics in different, first, you know, within the Christian tradition, because that's the tradition that I grew up in and that I come from. But also I, you know, read mystics outside of Christianity. And a lot of that, you know, what you're calling like woo woo, amongst the mystics actually resonates very deeply within process thinking. So it's part of why I like it. Cause yeah, God is, God isn't somehow like out there up in the sky, right? God isn't, you know, causing like a puppet master or something like that, but rather God is present in and through all things in each moment. Again, constantly alluring us towards the good, the beautiful, the true, this kind of thing. So yeah, we can say like when we suffer, like God knows what it's like for Josh Patterson to experience suffering in a very real sense. Like God knows that experience in the same way that God knows like what it's like to experience suffering as Kendall. Like that's yeah,
that's beautiful. That's interesting. Because is it in the Bible, or is it some traditions that are like God wanted to experience what it was like to be human, or like to understand humans, so he sent Jesus to live a human life to understand and relate to us?
Yeah, I don't know if I mean, I like that idea. I don't know if it's like specifically in the Bible or not.
Mm-hmm.
But I've, another way to say that I've heard is from Richard Rohr. And Rohr says God becomes the things that God loves.
Mm.
And so in the incarnation specifically of Jesus, right? Jesus of
Mm-hmm.
Nazareth, God is becoming what God loves through the
Mm-hmm.
incarnation, as a human, which is like, in my opinion, that, different theological traditions emphasize different moments in Jesus's life, right? Like the
Right.
incarnation, the crucifixion, the resurrection, the ascension. For me, the magic, so to speak, is in the incarnation.
Mm.
Maybe that's being a little bit too anthropocentric, like too human focused. But there's something really cool about, the creator of the universe, or whatever you want to call it, becoming incarnate in a
Mm-hmm.
human. Choosing
Yeah.
solidarity, God choosing to not be God without us, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Right. Um, and so what are some of the things that are entailed in number 2 in No Person is an Island, all things are interconnected?
Yeah, so this is really true. This is just kind of recognizing that the kind of hyper individualism doesn't work. I can't tell the story of Josh Patterson without also telling the story of my wife, Noelle. Or in the same way, I can't fully tell the story of Josh Patterson without, telling the story now of me being like having this conversation with you.
Right.
Um, and so it's just a deep recognition of the actual, like, genuine interrelatedness, the interconnectedness of all things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in the sense where, like, within process thought, again, Whitehead called it like a philosophy of organism. So if you think of everything as one organism, if you go into that organism and then start to like pull out pieces of it to examine them, the organism itself, you're not going to get the whole story of the organism without the
Right.
individual. But in the same way, you can't know the individual without the whole.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it works both ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, if that makes sense.
That's beautiful. I went to a Buddhist temple once, and what he spoke about was about a flower, and how a flower is not just one thing. It's the petal, it's the leaf, it's the stem, and all of that are important parts of the flower to make it, live and grow. But it's also a seed. But that seed changes. But it's also like that needs the soil, needs the what. So everything is interconnected, and I just thought it was such a beautiful lesson. And I guess with that, it's like God is also interconnected, and so
Uh
that's what leads to number 1, like
huh.
that we also contribute to God and God's experience. And yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, like, one way that I have found helpful, and I've, talk about it this way on my podcast a lot, is that if I were to take this relational teaching seriously, um, this is when I talk about something like sin, right? Whatever
Mm-hmm.
sin means. I think sin arises out of what I call like the illusion of separateness. Because if everything really is, if no person is an island and all things really are deeply connected, then when I believe I'm separate from another person, then I can do very bad things. Like I can be racist and I can
Mm-hmm.
kill people. I can exploit you, whatever. Or if I believe that I'm separate from creation or the universe, then we can do really bad things like destroying the environment and causing a massive climate crisis, right? Or if I believe that I'm separate from the divine, all sorts of really bad, shitty theology emerges, and people take something meant for good and turn it into evil. Or if I believe I'm separate from myself, right, then all sorts
Mm-hmm.
of kind of like mental health crises and all sorts of things. And so I think really this is part of one of my favorite aspects of process thinking, this, the relational aspect, because I think it gives such a helpful reframing that if maybe more people saw it and took it seriously, I think it has transformative power.
Mm-hmm.
Because then we can, recognize when Jesus says, like, what you do unto the least of these, you do unto me. Like
Mm,
Jesus wasn't just saying something nice and cute, like he meant that. Like in
right.
a very real sense, what I do to myself, I do to my neighbor. What I do to my neighbor, I do to myself. Like this kind of thing, um, because it is all deeply interconnected. We can't tell our full story without everybody else. So
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And I mean, that connects with the mystics, with the oneness. And
hmm
yeah, that's beautiful. And that I think that's a great definition of sin. It's when we believe we're separate from others and from God, and try to do things on our own or just for our own self-interest.
yeah, because then I think you're because like I take that pretty seriously. So I'm saying like I'm making a metaphysical claim that everything is connected.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we act against that, we're acting against the grain of like how the universe works, right?
Right.
And then that's why it causes all sorts of friction and problems and whatever is because like yeah, we're challenging how like the very foundation of things is.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Mm-hmm.
even within like one thing that we can learn with crazy stuff like quantum physics.
I was about to bring that up. Yeah.
Yeah, is that like once we get down to like the smallest what building blocks whatever um of how things are, it's relationship. It's not there isn't like a little Lego piece that then we like
Mm-hmm.
stack up, but rather it's like a lot of empty space and a lot of relating.
Right.
So it's
Right.
like built up of it's pretty cool.
Yeah. It's like reality is made up of relationship rather than uh, when I think of theism. It's like the spiritual and the physical are separate, and God chooses when to bring the spiritual down to the physical, rather than like he's above, but he's also within all things, and our actions also affect the ontological reality, and that kind of I think helps explain like miracles or stuff like when it says like Jesus couldn't do any miracles in his hometown, or Jesus said your faith has healed you. It's like we are an active participant, and we can help create or hinder miracles because we're also a part of that relationship of allowing that to happen or hindering that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And that's actually like one of the that kind of like split that you talked about, the like spiritual and the physical. That's one of the things that process thinking is trying to help overcome is kind of that like bifurcation of nature,
Mm.
so to speak.
Dualistic.
Uh, yeah, exactly. The dualism. Um, but geez, and this gets into a whole bunch of stuff. But process thought, like a lot of what they're trying to do is like it's a naturalistic theism. So within process thought, there's not this idea that like God is again outside of the
Mm-hmm.
created order and then like breaks in sometimes and like does some cool stuff and then pieces out again. But rather, God is like they're one and the same. They're like
Mm-hmm.
it's baked into the system. So God doesn't have to break in sometimes because God is already
Mm-hmm.
present in and through
He's
all
already
things at all
there.
times.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's like this more naturalistic kind so like the big way of saying it was like naturalistic dipolar theism. um and that's kind of the bit, but that's pushing back against like some things within the philosophical tradition um, where people did kind of bifurcate like the spiritual and the
Mm-hmm.
physical, right? So you
Right.
have these kind of two within like philosophy, you have like these kind of like two big camps. You have the
Mm-hmm.
reductionistic materialist, which is like kind
Mm-hmm.
of the popular thing in science, right? Where it's
Right.
like everything is just matter.
Mm-hmm.
And this conversation we're having is just brain chemicals. It doesn't mean
Right.
anything. It's all an illusion. So you
Mm-hmm.
have that on one hand, and then you have the dualist on the other hand, where mind and body are separate, or mind and or like the
Mind and
matter
spirit.
and
Mm-hmm.
spiritual are separate.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and what process thinking is doing is saying that like, well, we actually think both of those are like a similar position because the materialist and the spiritual or like the dualist, they assume the same thing about matter and what matter is. And then the, dualists just add this extra spiritual element onto it. Process people are saying, no, they actually, it's a monism. They're one and the same.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if that makes sense. So it's
Oh yeah.
breaking that kind of dualism and saying that they're actually together.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. I I've talked about this before. Like in my awakening, I kind of had this realization. I was like, oh, God is in everything. And I had a graph and I was like plotting time and space and thinking about metaphysics. And I was like, where did this come from? It's just, and we see many of the mystics had that experience with God, and they're like, oh, God is a part of all things. He's in me. He's within everyone. And it kind of goes along with the third point. And I just felt like I saw God in everybody. And I was like, some people are more aware of it. They act out of that spirit more, but he's in everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And in each moment of becoming, the divine is present, offering again like possibilities. And like for some people, because of how their their like life experience or something like that, the kind of possibilities available to them are going to be different than the kind of possibilities available to somebody, say, who like, I don't know, prays all the time, grew up in the church, whatever. Not because God is choosing sides, but just because God allows people to do their thing. Right. And so the kind of possibilities that God can offer me versus like, I don't know, I'm not trying to like set myself up as like good and noble or something, but like say like a serial killer, right? To really set the bar low for myself. The kind of possibilities available to the serial killer are different than me. Because, there's probably a lot of trauma there, et cetera, et cetera. So
right.
God is constantly offering these divine possibilities in each moment of becoming. Yeah.
Yeah. I think how I think about it is through the lens of psychology. And it's like, oh, if I understood this person, what they've been through, it would probably make sense why they are the way they are. Yeah. And of course we still have free will. We still have to make the best of what we got. But a lot of time it's like, how can you be loving and appreciate that and accept that and live that out if you haven't really experienced that from other people growing up yourself?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And if maybe another helpful example, I'll try to push it into the realm of theology and talk about Jesus for a second.
Yeah.
So like one way of thinking about Jesus in a process, perspective would be to say that Jesus, instead of focusing necessarily on like the sinlessness of Christ, of Jesus, would talk about the fidelity of Jesus to the divine lore. So if all of us are being given this, divine lore in each moment, and we have the ability to
fidelity, can you explain what that is?
Oh, sorry, fidelity. Yeah, faithfulness.
Faithfulness, got it.
Yeah, so fidelity is like faithfulness to the call. So, if each of us, and everybody in each passing moment is being given these divine possibilities, we can either give in or not, right? So Jesus, like, perfectly gave in to the divine call. Jesus was faithful to the divine lure, the call, whatever, of God in each passing moment, in such a way that Jesus literally became the image of God. Because if God is spirit, right, and God needs you and I, people, creation, to image God's self, by being faithful in each moment, Jesus literally becomes the image of God, because Jesus is perfectly living into the divine call in each passing moment. So like my buddy Trip Fuller, when he explains this, he uses a reference to a movie called This Is Spinal Tap, which I've still never seen. Don't tell Trip. I still haven't seen it. And he kind of talks about Jesus being turned up to 11. There's like a bit in that movie where the band, it's like a mockumentary, and the band is like showing their new speakers, and they had the manufacturer, instead of them just going up to 10, they had him turn the speakers up to 11. And the guy's like, well, why'd you do that? And he was like, well, it's one more than 10, isn't it? Like, they go up to 11. And so Tripp was like, yeah, Jesus is like up to 11. And then I'm like, well, me for Josh Patterson, maybe on a good day, I'm hitting like a 6 or 7, but it's like that giving into that divine call in each moment, which is, I think, one way that Jesus was unique, was his fidelity to the divine call, if that makes sense.
Right. I was going to ask you a little bit later, but you're already bringing it up about Jesus, because I like how my friend John Chafee says it, that Jesus embodied both the best, fully human and fully divine in one being, and they're not separate, human and divine. It's actually that's who we are to becoming both fully and divine in flesh. And so people are like, oh, Jesus was God incarnate, but it's like, if God is in all things and he's in us, and we're human, but we also have divine in us, is God is in essence, God is human like us, but he just lived it out perfectly, and we're not there. We're not there yet.
Yeah.
Is that in line with process thought?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I love that image, or that way of speaking. And I think too, it gives us kind of, again, I think it has transformative power. Like, I'm interested in the pragmatics of that. Like, if we're
Right.
recognize that like the divine is present within me in the same way that it's in you, and take that seriously, then that's going to like change how we live our lives and treat each other and things like that. So yeah, very, very much so. I think that's a really helpful way of talking about it. And also too, like, you know, if you want to just say like, well, screw Josh Patterson, I don't care what he thinks. Paul in the New Testament says you are God's. And so
well, Jesus says that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so it's like, it's being thrown out there. Like, it's there, it's present. And so like, you know, Jesus was divine and so can you. It's like how, maybe right, how I would say it.
Yeah. Yeah. Come back to wrap around again. There's so much more to that. In the third one, we seek heaven in a wildflower, or we seek to see heaven in a wildflower. All living things have value. Is that synonymous with original goodness?
Yeah. Well, so I definitely think original goodness is present there, because it is a recognition that things, you know, were created good. But I think also too, it holds this like deep, it basically values, everything has deep intrinsic value, within a process relational framework. And I'm not just talking about people, but like all things.
Right.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I mean, the original goodness idea definitely fits there. It would play nicely, because yeah, if you want to take seriously, like, oh, it was good, it was good, it was good, it was very good, right. Like that kind of thing. Then yeah, very, very much so. Original goodness would resonate with that.
Right. And I think it goes too with the, you know, panentheism and God as being in all things. And so it's like, that's what gives us life. That's he's the ground of all being. And without him, we wouldn't have life. We would be dead. The earth wouldn't have life. It would be dead. And so at the core, we have that goodness. And I think too, like, even talking about like medically, I think that so many times I'm getting a little off track, but like when we're sick, it's actually a process of us working to heal ourselves. And so our body is good. It's pure at its essence, I guess. And so we don't have to think of this dualistic, like fighting against ourselves and our flesh. And, you know, there's problems, there's ego, there's sin, whatever, but that's not the core. And so I think it gives a little bit shift and different flavor. And so you can start to build a relationship with yourself and trust in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I like how you said that it's like not the core, or it's not like the essence of who we are, right? Because I think ultimately, not always, there's not everybody teaches original sin this way, but the way that I was growing up being taught was like the kind of like worm theology that like, you are garbage.
Jonathan Edwards.
Yes, right. Yeah, you can't do anything good. Like nothing that you do is good. It's all filthy rags, blah, 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 blah. And that was like, that was making a claim about the essence, the core of who I am. So like, I think within like a process relational framework, people are still going to be like, yeah, people do dumb stuff all the time. Like, it's rather obvious. Like, turn on the news and see people killing each other. Right. That's not good. But that's not the core of who that person is. There's something deeper. There's something inherently valuable. There's something again, like, yeah, intrinsic to the worthiness of all things. And
Mm-hmm.
again, I think that point too ties into number two, the kind of relational aspect. Because again, when everything has that kind of deep value, then you're going to treat it as such, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Almost kind of like the idea, like namaste, right? Which is like the recognition, like, the divine in me
See the divine
recognizes
in
the divine in
you.
you. Yeah,
Yep.
that kind of thing. But like taking
Mm-hmm.
that and then expanding it everywhere.
Right, right.
Yeah.
It's still so funny to me because a lot of Christians are like, "Oh, yeah, Imago Dei, everyone's made in God's image," but they won't take that next step of the divine in everyone and that original goodness in everybody. Um, it's a little frustrating, but it's fine.
Yeah, absolutely. And even too, because you can find it like that isn't necessarily just like oh well, you guys are just progressive liberal kind of thing, right? Like um Carmen Imes, for example, she uh writes, she's like an evangelical Old Testament scholar. And she's done a lot of work around this understanding of the image of God, and uses the Bible and talks about how Genesis narrative is like very similar to that of like building a temple.
Mm-hmm.
And that the like humans were kind of placed in the temple, and so to speak, in Genesis as the image, right? So as the idol, um, as in like when you would go to a temple, whatever god that you were there to worship, they'd have images of that god in the temple. People are that thing. Like when creation was made, within
Mm-hmm.
the Hebrew text, God placed people as the image in the temple. So like
Mm,
people literally are called to be the image of God, are called to
right.
image the divine into
Mm-hmm.
creation. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think original sin um, it cuts that out because it's not a
Yeah.
recognition again of that goodness that you're talking about. But also recognize like that's pretty big. Like if God wanted to represent God's self and was like, I'm going to throw some people in there, like we should probably take like the human vocation's kind of cool, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Have you read Pete Enns' latest book, Curveball?
I have. Yes,
Oh, it's amazing.
yes,
It's my
it's a really
favorite of
good
his,
book.
actually.
Oh,
Yeah.
nice, right on. Yeah, Pete's a
Uh,
good dude. He's going to be at
the
Theology
beer
Beer
camp.
Camp again.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. That'll be great. He was really big in my spiritual journey and understanding. And I actually have someone going to be on the podcast talking about early Christianity that goes to the seminary that he teaches at. So, and it actually was editing Curveball. So,
nice. That's really
that'll be
cool.
fun.
Yeah,
Uh,
nice.
but in the book Curveball, I really like the chapter on Christ and in the church as his body, and how Christ's work is unfinished without us. We need to live out his body as his body to continue his work and continue that restoration of all things.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I liked that bit too, and that's kind of again that idea. If God is spirit, God doesn't have like a physical body. Then yeah,
Mm-hmm.
God needs us. Is like calling on us
Right.
to live into that, to literally be the body of Christ, like
Mm-hmm.
to use Christian language. So yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
enjoyed that chapter. Yeah, I enjoyed that chapter as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, before I get to the big one,
Okay.
um, how does how does it fit within that? But not all of them identify as process people.
Yeah. So like, and this is going to show my limited understanding, but I think process kind of takes things and pushes them a bit further. Like I think a lot of it would end up coming down to like what aspects of like classical theology gets denied, right? Um, and like how that plays out. Um, Process just kind of I think takes open and relational theology and pushes it further. I don't have
Mm-hmm.
another good way of saying that. I'm trying to think
Right.
of like a helpful example. Because all right, so like a lot of, maybe this will be helpful. A lot of process thinkers tend to also have a very deep pluralism about them when it comes to
Mm-hmm.
different faith traditions.
Right.
While that isn't necessary of a lot of open relational thinkers.
Mm-hmm.
Um, or like maybe another way of saying it is like there are a lot of like open and relational thinkers within kind of like more evangelical traditions, or more conservative traditions. So they don't, I'm sorry, I don't have good language.
No, that's
They
fine.
don't like push it as far.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's just debates over different like theological topics. Like
Right.
kenosis is one that comes to mind. Like people will debate how far to push kenosis, like which is
Mm-hmm.
the divine self-emptying, the self-giving of God. Some people are uncomfortable with the idea that God is in process and changing, so
Mm-hmm.
they won't affirm that kind of thing, but they'll still say that like the future is not settled.
Mm-hmm.
So like maybe that's actually like a really easy example that was just escaping my
Mm-hmm.
mind. They can still have like hold a lot of the other like classical like theology perspectives, but
Mm-hmm.
then just like reject that the future is settled,
Mm-hmm.
something like that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, and it's also part of why it's difficult is because like open and relational is such a big umbrella, and in the same way, process is big as well because you don't have process thinkers just within the Christian tradition. Um, I don't think it works, but you have atheists that are process thinkers. um,
Mm-hmm.
or you have Buddhists that are process thinkers, or
Mm-hmm.
Muslims that are process thinkers.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah. I see a lot of Buddhism in this. That's great.
there's a ton of Buddhism in it. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a lot of work that happens a lot. A lot of interfaith dialogue between process
Mm-hmm.
relational thinkers within the Christian tradition and Buddhist of all flavors.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
just with like Eastern thought in general, like a lot of Hinduism, these kind of things, they play nicely.
Mm-hmm. Well, I
Yeah.
was going to ask about number one, being is becoming, because in Eastern perspective, as far as I understand, that our essence is like the Atman, the Brahman, like our essence is divine, and so that's who we truly are. And so, would they be comfortable with saying being is becoming?
They as in like people who hold to
The
like Atman is Brahman and Brahman is Atman.
Yeah, just like the Buddhist perspective or Hindu.
Yeah, I think it would depend on the person. But there's
Mm-hmm.
definitely a lot of play there, and a lot of deep resonance. I'm trying to think of like a helpful way to say it or to put it, because that's one thing for me that I've had a lot of friends with people who are like PhD scholars in this field, and I'm
Right.
like maybe one day I'll get there.
Mm-hmm.
But I've enjoyed a lot of the kind of thinking you're talking about and reading people like Alan Watts, and I've
Mm-hmm.
had conversations about how they're similar, um, and there definitely are some differences, but I don't think it would be difficult for people to say that, because ultimately what being is becoming is saying is that we're not we're not static. Like there's not a static substance called Josh Patterson,
Mm.
but the very act of being like
Mm-hmm.
is becoming, because in each moment
Right.
where
And I
it's
guess that makes sense if God is always his the Brahman would be the part of God that is experience, is the universe
mhm.
that is always becoming, and that's a part of who we are. And so I get, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it's yeah, I wish I had a better answer to that question, because I know there is one.
Right.
um
That's fine.
but like I do know one thing I like about process thinking is that it has deep resonances with something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can kind of tap into that. One way recently that's been handed to me about thinking about this is like not confusing how does he say it? Um not confusing love with the beloved. So like I could express to you why I love my wife, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you would like then have an understanding of that. But at the same time, you're not then going to like ask for my wife's phone number, right? but you're still going to have the understanding of what that love is. But just the beloved is something different. Like I'm applying that thing love to, the beloved. And in the same way,
so I'm interconnected to that by you explaining it to me, but I'm not you, and I'm not in that relationship.
Yeah, exactly. You're not in the relationship, but then also too, you can then go into your life and recognize like, oh, there are experiences where I too experience this thing called love, and it's not necessarily just connected to Josh's wife. Like it doesn't. Right. It's not that. Like you experience
the principle
love in your own life.
Is in there, is in other areas as well.
Yeah, so you're not confusing the two, right? Yeah. Like I know John Cobb kind of uses that analogy to talk about like a deep religious pluralism. Tripp Fuller has picked up on that kind of language as well. But yeah, I don't know if that gets at it at all, but
yeah, that's helpful. I appreciate that. I didn't expect to be talking about.
Yeah, no, right. Yeah, exactly. It's a weird one, but it's a fun one because it gets at the heart of it pretty quickly, because we all know what that is, right? We've seen movies about people falling in love or whatever. And then we have that own experience for ourselves without necessarily trying to go get the phone numbers of like everyone else who falls in love with somebody else kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. So, I think it's come to the big question, if all these things that we're talking about is true, then what is the meaning of Jesus and the cross? How does the process thinkers think about that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And different process thinkers will talk about that differently. Because basically what you're not gonna find is like you're not gonna find the kind of like penal substitutionary atonement. Like that's not really going to be affirmed within a process thinker, because it doesn't work within the system. But one way that I find that I have found helpful, and I'm going to butcher it so bad, but in his book Divine Self-Investment, Tripp uses this analogy of the have you seen like the Christmas Carol, like the famous what is it, Charles Dickinson or whatever?
Yeah, right.
So within
the ghosts,
exactly, yeah. There's the three ghosts. So I'm trying to remember. You have the ghost of the past, present, and future, right? So in each moment, like what's cool about that is that past, present, and future are kind of like the three powers, so to speak, within process thinking, and that gets like into like weeds philosophically. But what's cool about this is he's talking about Scrooge, right? And Scrooge is shown his past, and so his past is then becoming real to him in the present moment, and he's recognizing like all this like terrible things that he's done, how he's like screwed over people he's loved, etc. And then he's shown his present reality, and again in that present moment Scrooge is not comfortable with who he is, right? And that's like all sorts of jacked up. And then you have the ghost of the future, like, hey, Scrooge, guess what? If you continue doing this thing, if you continue being the person you are in the present, then your future is not looking so bright. And so it gives Scrooge the right nightmare, right? Because then Scrooge awakens to the reality that like, hey, I have a shitty past, and guess what? I can't change that, but I can change how I relate to it in the present moment. And so Scrooge ends up changing how he relates to his past, and then in the present becomes the person that he wants to be, right? Because our being is our becoming. So if we are who we are becoming is another way of saying that. And so like if you want to be a generous person, then just start being generous in the present moment, and then like you will become that. And ultimately that'll lead to the future. And so the cross acts in a very similar way. The cross gives us the right nightmares. The cross shows us what happens when like a Jewish rabbi is killed by the state, right? Because he'd rather bear crosses than build them. And so it's this image of what it looks like when um, the divine is imaged perfectly, and then the world rejects that. And so it's not just this kind of boring, like, oh, Jesus was a nice guy, now we can follow him, but rather Jesus gives us like the right kind of nightmares, but also too, because of the past, like I'm going to use some process language here, so forgive me, but in each moment of becoming, the process word is prehend. We're prehending the past in its entirety, which means it's subconscious. We're feeling the past. So because of the act that Jesus did in each moment of our becoming, we prehend the actions of Jesus, and we have the ability to choose to live into that or to not.
Right.
The divine lore, I think maybe we could talk about it as like the divine lore became stronger. Like Jesus is almost like we upgraded our, cell phone from 3G to 5G with Jesus, right? And so now the divine lore is being amplified louder and more present and more active. And that opens up more generative possibilities and creativity in each moment of becoming, where we can choose to live into what it looks like to be the image of God via the person of Jesus. And so the cross offers all of that. And also you could say the cross is a critique of empire, right? Like, what happens when perfect love shows up? Empire crushes it. Those kind of things. So yeah, and I don't know. Those things, I don't know if anything I just said made sense, because
Oh, that was great.
a process relational atonement theory is something that is very much on my mind, and is something that I wrestle with. And so like that antenna idea is, I haven't shared that before. That's like full sail in my mind. I don't know if it works.
Oh, wow.
Nice. kind of thing. So we'll see.
I think that was great. I really appreciated that. And that's cool that that's something new come out of you that you haven't expressed yet in all your podcasts. I've enjoyed when you've talked about the atonement, stuff like that. Because I'm right there with you. I can see and understand how Jesus changed the psychology and understanding of humanity. Now, I'm trying to be open that maybe, like, I would definitely say I'm not on board with the substitutionary penal atonement belief that God needed, like, he needed a blood sacrifice to save himself. So for us to be in relationship with him, personal relationship, I don't believe that. But if there's some mysterious way, I think like C.S. Lewis is like the deeper magic when Aslan, and so it's like, what is that exactly? I don't know. It's some law of the universe that we don't understand. Maybe Jesus died and satisfied that law in some way. Perhaps I don't know, but what I can understand is how that he eradicated the belief that we needed to have any more blood sacrifices to have a personal relationship with God, and that we to continue in this guilt and shame and fear. And it's like, no, God has forgiven you. So now live in a relationship with him. And the symbolic, like you said, Jesus and the symbolic meaning of what he did always stays with us. Cause there's always times where, I'll sin and be like, I want to stick in that guilt and that shame. Or even you can say anger and be like, I didn't do anything. But then it was like, I can understand God forgave me, so I don't need to sit in that, and I can die to myself and then live through the Spirit of God within me. And so I can see that, and that makes total sense to me. So I like the way you put it as well. It's really great.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because I was listening to a podcast earlier today when I was cutting the grass, and they were talking about how when Paul uses the language of sinner, it's not something that Paul uses to like talk poorly about others, but rather sinner is the language that Paul uses to refer to himself after he comes into the recognition of the relationship that he has with the divine. And so why that's so interesting is because it's a total reversal. Because what does the church do a lot? It goes around and tells people that they are sinners and that they then need something for this to become, fixed or something like that. But that's not what Paul was doing. Like, Paul was recognizing, like, that, like, I've always been connected with the divine, and when I do dumb stuff, that's what it means to be a sinner. It's like, again, it's going against that grain of reality. Because even, like, Jesus, when he was going around, like, forgiving sins and stuff, he was doing that way before
he died.
He did the whole cross thing.
Yeah.
So that can't, necessarily be the thing. I think, for me, and I have to figure out the technical language of how to fit this into process thought, but, like, salvation is this, like, is the awakening to and the recognition of, like, the interconnectedness of all things.
Right.
And recognizing reality for what it is. It's wakening up to what's really true, awakening from that illusion. And I think Jesus
that's what
helps us do that.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm getting excited here.
No, you're good. Get excited. Get hyped.
Yeah, I'm hyped. Well, again, what my friend John Jaffe says is that Jesus didn't change reality. He showed us a better picture of what reality actually is. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, yeah, God is within you. The temple is your body this whole time. It's just like you didn't realize it, and you're putting up all these blocks to meet the divine, but it's always been there within you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's like the already not yet aspect of, like, the kingdom of God thing.
Yeah.
Is that it is a present reality that we can live into, but at the same time, it's not fully actualized, right?
Yes.
Like my buddy Aaron Simmons, he has a really cool new book out called Camping with Kierkegaard. He's a philosopher and a nerd, but he talks about this in light of, like, fishing. He loves fishing, right? And so he talks about, like, when he goes fishing, obviously he wants to catch fish, but that's not the whole point. So, like, he goes fishing because he's a person that, he wants to be the kind of person that goes fishing. And so it's like it's not in the catching fish, but rather as becoming the kind of person that goes fishing, that spends times in the rivers, etc. And so by participating in the practice of fishing, by stepping into the river and actually doing the fishing, he is then living into the kind of person that he wishes to become. And so it's that already not yet. He's doing it.
Yeah.
He's living it, like living in the fishing kingdom of God or something like that, whatever, blending the metaphor. But so, like, in the same way, when we, live into what Jesus says the kingdom of God is, we are being the kind of people who are anticipating this, future when the kingdom of God is fully actualized, but we're living into it in the here and now. So it's that already not yet. It's a way of orienting oneself in the world, not because of some kind of, like, strict set of beliefs, but rather it's a way of living faithfully into the kind of reality or the kind of person that we wish to create.
I think that's great. I think Paul kind of talked about that in his own way, and that was a big part of my journey a long time ago, way before my awakening, when I read Romans 8 about how we're no longer sinners, we're perfected in Christ. And so it's like, we're still becoming that. Like, our sin is still trying to drag us down and hold us back, but we don't identify as sinner anymore. But it seems like churches, evangelical, they don't realize that or recognize that. It's like, no, we're sinners. And so I feel like it's a failure to see ourselves in that new identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, too, interestingly enough, it kind of plays into this idea that has often been called amongst, different philosophical thinkers, like the idea of, like, the sacred object, that there's this thing out there that exists, that if we got it, then life would be good. Then we would be perfect and complete. So maybe it's, if we got that promotion, if we made X amount of dollars, if we married this person, if I got this sports car, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And we see this kind of myth of the sacred object propagated throughout like TV commercials and society and all this kind of stuff. But the truth of the matter is, once people get that thing, they're still not satisfied.
Right.
Because again, it's a myth. And
Mm-hmm.
so oftentimes the church can do the same thing by literally essentially making God the sacred object.
Mm.
And so then that's where I think a lot of like you're just a dirty sinner, this kind of stuff comes from. And like, oh, but once you have God, right? Once you have that cross shaped hole in your heart filled, then you'll be good. But it's a failure to recognize the reality of things in which like you're already good.
Right.
And so like the part of the act of faith is believing what is already true about you. It's like accepting that God is telling you like, no, you are already loved. You already belong. You're already good. And part of the act of faith is actually believing that grace is true. Not just for me, but also for you and for your enemy and for your neighbor and et cetera, et cetera. So,
yeah, that's beautiful. That's great. I love it. How would you talk to Christians who are like, people don't know Jesus, so they're not saved or whatever, like, and how I've tried to think about it or talk about it is, if you're living out the fruits that Jesus did, that's the same thing. And that is also evident within creation, and other people live out these fruits. And so whether people know Jesus specifically, I hope they do. And I think that's very helpful, but they can learn who Jesus is through many, many ways, different, like the Spirit will work in anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a big question, the question of pluralism. That's a good one though. Actually, I just got this book in the mail about that. And I've read a couple other, but the way that I would talk about it, because I agree with you. So I think like, if we believe like X, Y, and Z is the fruit of the Spirit, and we see people exemplifying the fruits of the Spirit, then like, hey, something's going on there. Even if they like don't call whatever they're doing Christ or Jesus or something like that, right? But also too, for me, if I genuinely believe that God is present and acting in and through all things, and seeking to bring us all towards, goodness and beauty and truth and this kind of thing, then that means God is willing to meet each and every single one of us in our own context, in our own journeys of becoming, and meet us where we're at and relate to each of us in such a way that we can understand. And so that means I think God is active and present in and through my Muslim brothers and sisters in the same way that I think God is active and present in the Buddhist and in the, whoever. And that's not to say that I think all religions are the same or somehow like God is tricking people. But rather I'm trying to affirm all of these different expressions, right, of the divine in these different traditions, and say that what I think is meaningful is that we inherit the tradition that we find ourselves in a way that's faithful to that tradition, but also seek to learn from the different traditions as well, because I think they too are interacting with the same divine presence, the same God that I'm interacting with as well. And I happen to be in a Christian context, and I like this Jesus guy and stuff. And so like I favor that, and I want to be honest in saying that I favor the Christian tradition. But I also want to say that God is active and present in and through these different traditions as well. Not in a way to reduce them all into one and the same thing. I think religions are asking different questions and giving different answers, and that's really great. And that's fine. But we should have the humility to be able to tap in and learn from all of those traditions. And at the
Yeah.
same time, yeah, know, like, as Julian of Norwich says, that, like, all will be well,
Right.
kind of thing.
Yeah. I was just thinking today how Eastern perspective, the way we talk about salvation and Jesus wouldn't really connect with them the same because they've always had this understanding that they're connected and yeah, the Amen and the Brahman and so the way we said it is Jesus came to show us what reality was, and they already had that kind of understanding of the divine. But I think that where Christianity, where Jesus really shines through, is the way to live that out. And so I would say like Buddhism maybe has a better understanding of reality, of the oneness, but Christianity has the best example of how to live in this physical world as an example of divine and human in flesh.
Yeah, yeah, I like that. I think that, yeah, accepts and treats both traditions well and fairly, and I also think too, within a lot of Eastern cultures, they don't have this kind of like hyper individualism that we find a lot in the West, and then especially in
Right.
not all forms of Christianity, but in a lot of Christianity, it's hyper individualism, right? The salvation question is are you saved, right? It's about individuals.
Right.
Where I would argue, like, even like within the Hebrew scriptures, like the Jews didn't understand salvation as this individual thing. It was communal. And again, this comes back to the process relational stuff, right? My salvation is intricately wrapped up and tied into your salvation. And so I'm not saved until you are, and vice versa.
Right.
And so, like, yeah, it's not this hyper individualistic thing. I think that communal aspect really matters. And again, that ties into that, like, understanding that no person is an island and that all things are deeply interconnected. But then you find that too in like liberation theology within the Christian tradition. Right. Or like just think about, like, again, the Hebrew Bible, it wasn't about like individual people in Israel being saved. It was about Israel, right? It's inherently communal.
Right.
And I think that's, again, one thing that like the kind of Eastern traditions bring in nicely as well is that communal aspect. You don't have kind of the hyper individualism that you find within a lot of Western thought.
Yeah, that's great. Does process theologians have a common or maybe similar views about I don't know what the theological term, but like the end times or the kingdom of heaven coming on, coming down, or what that looks like?
Yeah, so like some kind of like process eschatology.
Eschatology, there's the word.
Yeah, they're so I know of a kind of variety of perspectives. Different people have different ways of talking about that. Because within the process relational framework, right, like there's no guarantee of that. And this isn't something
future
that
doesn't exist.
Right, the future doesn't necessarily exactly. And something that I haven't said explicitly, but like God is not a God of coercion. God doesn't override, and again, within the process relational framework, God doesn't override our free will, and this is kind of a rejection of omnipotence, is what that is. And so, if God isn't omnipotent, as in God doesn't have all the power, God isn't a puppet master, something like that, but rather we have genuine freedom. The kind of eschaton is not, there's no guaranteed future. We can have hope and also recognize that, God ultimately probably will hopefully get God's way, right? But it's going to require creation to cooperate. And so the kingdom of God coming to earth is dependent on us like actually believing it and buying into it. It's not just like we can't just like say like thoughts and prayers kind of thing. Like there's actually it it actually amplifies the human vocation, and also invites us into kind of that, again, that's that already not yet, that kind of future that we're hoping to create. You and I have the ability to create that future with God, right? With the divine, by giving into it. And so people talk about it differently. I know.
So does that make process theologians hopeful universalists?
Oh yeah, well, so all right, so Tom Ward. All right, I'll bring in my buddy Tom. So Tom is a process thinker, and instead of using the term hopeful universalist, Tom basically says that love is never gives up. Love is never ending. It's the unrelenting love view, is what he says. And so, because to be consistent to kind of the like God is non-coercive perspective, you have to say that the possibility of people not choosing to like choose God has to remain a real option. However, God's love is unrelenting. And so nobody, no matter how long it takes, is ever outside of the bounds and the love of God. God is constantly going to be present in and through all things, alluring that person into divine relationship.
He's just got more stamina than us.
Exactly right. Exactly.
That's what I say.
Yeah. God has all the stamina. And
because I mean, like sin and all that stuff, that's gonna wear you out. And so that's what I said is like, I think eventually everyone's gonna realize they're good. You know, God loving them, that's a better option. And eventually everyone's gonna choose that.
Yeah, I would think so, or at least I would hope so.
Right.
And that's kind of the perspective there. But like one thing, if I could just say it too, just to bring a little bit of clarity around the rejection of omnipotence, is that really comes from, and this was actually my like one of the big reasons I find process thought alluring, was because of what's called the problem of evil, right? So like, why is there bad things that happen in the world? And if God is all powerful and God could stop evil and doesn't, like, why is that? And so you have some people that say, i.e. like, you know, people who believe in total sovereignty, that God preordained everything exactly how God wants, and it's all for God's glory, right? So the Holocaust, God's doing, somehow people are still guilty even though God did it, and it's for God's glory. Or you have people say, well, like, no, people have free will, so God lets people do what they want, but God could stop them from doing bad stuff if God wanted to. Process thought actually takes that a step further and says, no, God cannot prevent genuine evil unilaterally because God is non-coercive. And so the wrinkle that I want to bring in there is to point out that this is not God limiting God's self. So this is back to a question asked earlier. This is one of the differences in open and relational and process thinking. Some open and relational thinkers will say God chooses to limit God's self. Process thinkers will say no, God does not limit God's self. This is the essence of who God is uncontrolling love. And so because that is who God is, God cannot prevent genuine evil unilaterally. Because if God could, right? Like say you were at a swimming pool, and you were there with your friend, and there was your friend's kid swimming in the pool. And then your friend, like, this is graphic, so forgive me, but like held the kid underwater to drown them. And you didn't do anything. And then this got brought to the courthouse. They would not say, wow, like, I'm really glad that you respected your friend's wishes to drown that child. Like, you didn't want to interrupt their freedom. No, you'd be like, you'd be in trouble. You would get in trouble for that. So if God could prevent genuine evil and chooses not to, then in my opinion, and in the opinion of process philosophers, God is on the hook for that kind of evil. And so we want to say, like, God can't unilaterally prevent genuine evil. And that's, again, to tie into your point about, like, we're called into imaging the divine. It's because God literally requires us to live into this kind of future, to give into the divine Lord, because God is not going to override our free will or our humanness. So I wanted to make
Mm-hmm.
that clear, because that's like a very important distinction in some of the thinking.
Yeah, no, that's great. And yeah, I became friends with Tom on Facebook. He sent me his excerpt of his books, and I read them, and I got that, and I've heard him on your podcast, and I think that's great. I think that's the best answer I've heard to the problem of evil, and yeah, that's just beautiful.
Yeah, Tom's a really good dude. And yeah, what Tom is really good at too. Like, so if you have listeners who are interested in like learning more about this, Tom is really good at taking the complexities of process thinking and kind of breaking them down so that normal people without PhDs like me can understand it.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And what I'm getting you to do for me.
Right on. But yeah, it's a good. No, stop. Sorry, my phone was ringing. But yeah, it's Tom's very helpful in that regard. So helpful resource.
Yeah, yeah. So getting back, do you have an idea of what it means for the kingdom of heaven to make that possible, or is heaven out there, or is it new heavens, new earth? What does that mean to you?
Yeah,
I'm just gonna find every hard
no,
question and ask you.
I appreciate it though, because it makes me actually like think about where I'm actually at on a lot of this stuff. So the kingdom of God thing, I would say that bringing about the kingdom of God is the call of every of humanity, but within a Christian context, it's the call of Christians, right? Is Jesus taught us to pray, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, and so to do that, we give into the divine lure towards the things that are good and beautiful, true in each moment, and that's how we participate within that kingdom, and bringing that kingdom. And now when we talk about, so I'm going to make a distinction that isn't necessarily fair, but when we talk about heaven, I don't fully know what I think about heaven yet, as in some kind of like post-mortem place that we go. I can tell you what I don't think is that we have some kind of like ethereal soul that like floats off into this place called heaven. I don't think that. But I think consciousness, whatever that is, continues on post-mortem. Like, I think that is something God has the ability to do. But within process thought, like the lowest, or like, yeah, the lowest kind of like thing that you get is called objective immortality, which is the idea that, so in each moment of becoming, right, God is fully inheriting the world for what it is, and then evaluating and moving to the next moment. So the past, again, is now set. That past exists forever within the divine. And so I have objective immortality within the divine memory, in that I just existed. God remembers Josh Patterson forever, and my existence has changed and shaped God forever. Like I'm now a part of the divine. So at the very least, in process thinking, you at least get that. And there are some thinkers that's all that they can muster is that. And that's like kind of a cool thing. Like that's pretty good. But for a variety of other reasons, I am hopeful that there is some kind of conscious, subjective, as in like I am present, immortality going on. Because I think, like, I don't know, this might sound harsh, but I think there may be some lives that weren't quite worth living, not in the sense where I'm like, fuck that person, but like infants born with like rare conditions that they're born, they live 28 30 hours of a torturous existence, and then they die. Like that is tragic. And because I believe God is love and God is just, I I feel like that life is going to be redeemed somehow within the divine. And that gives me hope for some kind of like heaven, right? Some kind of post-mortem existence, whatever that looks like. I don't have a good answer for it. That's a very live question for me. Yeah, hopefully maybe that at least gets at something.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the honesty and that you're searching and you're open. And I mean, I don't know exactly. Obviously, I have some ideas. So yeah, I don't know if nobody in this life knows.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's great. I appreciate that. Yeah, this is all great. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you think is important to talk about, or that you want to talk about?
I could throw like a fun wrinkle into it. That's something that like I've been exploring more recently.
That
is pretty common within process thinkers. It's going to get like a little bit more theoretical, but it has to do with.
I love that.
It has to do with consciousness and like what that is, right? So there's a perspective within process thinking that is popular. Not all process thinkers think this way, but it's called either panpsychism or panexperientialism is another way of saying it. Panexperientialism was kind of coined by David Ray Griffin, who's a process thinker, to be a little bit more specific. But it's the idea that mentality is both fundamental and ubiquitous in creation. And so it's not, it gets at that bifurcation we talked about earlier,
right?
Where you have.
Is that the same thing as idealism?
Okay, so
idealism.
Yeah, so idealism is the idea that everything is mind.
Everything is consciousness?
Yes, everything is consciousness.
Okay.
So panexperientialism rejects that because it holds that like matter is still a real thing. It's essentially dual aspect monism is like the big word for it. So it's saying that consciousness and matter are not separate, but they're one and the same thing. And so, so it's not the idea that like if you go outside, like that tree, if I were to kick it, would get sad and start crying and be like, "Oh, Josh kicked me. He's such a jerk."
Yeah.
But rather that that experience goes all the way down. So even to the tiniest thing that makes up like the building blocks of creation, there's experience. Not in the same way that like you and I are conscious, right? We have a very complex form of experience that is consciousness. But that kind of experience goes all the way down. So that's the pan-experientialism. And that again then ties into like the seeing heaven in a wildflower thing. You can see how that fits, right? Because it's saying like everything has that kind of experience to it, but also it solves like, or it's an attempt to solve like the mind-body problem, or like the hard problem of consciousness, because materialist, so like reductionistic materialists, like the leading idea in science, can't explain consciousness. And then spiritual dualist can't explain it either, because they believe the same thing about matter that like the reductionistic materialists think. They just add the spiritual aspect. So and that gets into like a whole other big thing. And this is why, like, when you talk about God not being coercive, and you say like, oh, well, like, couldn't God have like picked up a rock because it's just matter? A process thinker could be like, well, no, it's not just matter. They would say like a vacuous actuality doesn't exist, that like even within the rock, the molecules making up that rock have some kind of experience. Not in the same way that you and I do.
Oh, so it's like even the rock has free will, and God can't be like, "Hey, rock, I'm gonna do whatever I want with you." The rock is like, "No, I want to do this."
Yeah,
in a sense.
In a sense, right? Like that would be like an exaggerated way of saying that, because this is like an aggregational system, like an aggregate. So like there's it gets very complex. That like pan-experientialism is something I'm currently studying, and it's like a whole can of worms. But that plays into the process world a lot. So
Mm-hmm.
if
Mm-hmm.
anything, maybe my point in bringing it up is like listeners might like do a Google search or something.
Yeah.
Because it's a lot. It's a lot.
I love consciousness, and I've talked to a guy. It just hasn't worked out, but a philosopher about consciousness and stuff like that. But the way I think about it is that consciousness isn't everything. Like the experiential part of God is consciousness, but the vehicle consciousness is in the vehicle is matter, and so that's going to affect how consciousness lives out. And so with there's a big difference between humans and rocks because of our vehicle and what is allowed within that. And so that's the differences that's where I'm at.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Why so like I've read
I'm
a
not
lot
sure
of
if that's idealism or like I haven't got into it that much, so
yeah, there'd be a lot
I
of
don't
like clarifying questions, but like I mean
Right.
I've read a ton of idealistic I mean there are like process people who are idealists like
mm-hmm.
Keith Ward is one of them. But like I've read a ton of idealist thinkers like Rupert Spira. I mean I'm looking at a stack of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of his books right here to my right.
Mm-hmm.
Like I found them helpful. Or people
Mm-hmm.
like Alan Watts, I think, kind of fall into that category.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and it's not bad. Like they're not. There's a lot of resonance between that and process thinking,
Mm-hmm.
for sure. There's just like
Mm-hmm.
some slight variations that ultimately end up
Right.
being big variations, but
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
nerdy stuff that I'm still trying to learn and figure out.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So I'm curious, why do you think the idea, and you were talking about this in your last episode, metaphysics, why has that been such a like under thought about or like a dirty word in Christian like theology over time? Or has it?
Yeah, well, so it got kind of metaphysics kind of got kicked out of even like the big kind of like philosophical questions for a while. And I think if I'm correct now, please people fact check me because this is me trying to do my best to remember. But I think essentially when things like science started being able to explain things, metaphysics became less important because they were like, oh, well, like we're just figuring out how stuff actually works. But like what they failed to realize is like the metaphysics kind of behind
the quantum
that.
physics
Like,
brought that back.
Yeah. And they're assuming a whole bunch of stuff within that,
right.
Which is again kind of the metaphysical.
Mm-hmm.
Like again, yeah, like a lot of science. What happened in science is there was this kind of bifurcation of nature. So what they did was they kind of reduced philosophy to like what physics can explain to us. And
right.
that's been very, very helpful, right? Like we've got all this like
right.
really cool
Newtonian
technology and like etc. But what that did was it gave us the quantitative aspect of things, but it left out the qualitative. So like physics can explain to us like gravity, but it can't explain to us the color red.
Right.
Like it can't do that, or it can't. Yeah. So
like dark matter, or
yeah,
like there's a whole bunch of things like dimensions and all these other things that we don't know exactly, but we have theories because Newtonian physics doesn't explain everything. It's become limited. We see that it's only explained things to a certain point.
Yes, exactly. And so people are recognizing that this language is limited, and we need a better way to think about things. So metaphysics is becoming popular again as people try to postulate how things work, and that's why actually people like Whitehead, the founder of process thinking, is becoming popular because he was like not popular in his day, but he is becoming popular again as we recognize the limits of what our kind of philosophical musings have done for us. And they're recognizing like, whoa, like basically my point is Whitehead was like way ahead of his time. And so like people are returning to that. And that also this pan-experientialism aspect or panpsychism aspect is also now another live option on the table because that was written off a long time ago as well. Again, just because of like the metaphysical assumptions, they were assuming this substance-based ontology, spirit or mind and matter were separate, blah, 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 and then going from there. And so people are saying like, well, wait a minute, maybe that's not how things actually are. And so that's the metaphysical bit.
Yeah. I love all that. That's great. I appreciate you bringing that in.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like a weird and nerdy world, but I think it's really important. Like it's metaphysics is getting down to like the thing behind the thing. Like it's super,
right. The foundation. It's really about ontology and epistemology, you could say.
Yeah, both of those things. Yeah, very much so. And there's a lot of fun thinkers doing cool stuff with that. But yeah, I don't know. Metaphysics is helpful to me because I'm trying to figure out the way things, like I want to be able to have a way of talking about and including like things like experience.
Phenomenology.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Josh, this was an amazing conversation. I really enjoyed it. We covered a lot of subjects, and man, I now that you've explained process theology and open relational, I resonate with it even more. So I guess I could include myself in that.
Yeah, welcome to the #process party. Right? Yeah, I've enjoyed it, man. It's been fun, and like I don't know. This is still although these are the waters I swim in, this is still something that I'm actively learning about. And like I told you before we started recording, there's like a million better people that I could think of to kind of talk about this. So I just appreciate you giving me the opportunity to do it. And this conversation was fun. And I don't know. I grew from it. I think you asked a lot of good questions that challenged and pushed me. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, you're welcome. I just appreciate your podcast and your journey, and just I feel like you have a authenticity and humility in that you're figuring things out and you haven't got it all figured out, and you're just bringing us along on the journey of your process of figuring things out, and so that's something that really resonates with me, and I try to embody the same thing. So thanks for coming on. You've said a lot of great things, and appreciate it.
Yeah, man, it was fun. We'll have to do it again sometime.
Yeah, awesome.